Today I'm joined by Chris Bagg. He is the head coach and founder of Campfire Endurance out of Bend, Oregon. Chris Bagg, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for being here, Phil. This is, it's been kind of a long time coming.
Yeah, how did we meet? Did we meet through Moxy Monitor? Was that
we met through
the
Moxy?
first
Yeah. So I had reached out to Roger to start talking about some kind of partnership or collaboration. And then he was like, "Oh my gosh, our physiologist lives in Redmond." And I was
Right.
like, "What? Why? You're kidding me." So you're sort of up the road. You're still almost an hour away, which is the nature of Central Oregon. Then you came down, you did some testing for some people in Campfire. We had a fun weekend where we watched a lot of athletes breathe hard and sweat, and I got to do my own Moxy and VO2 master test with you, and we both like podcasts, we both like synthwave, we both like physiology. We could have met at the Magic Sword show at the Volcanic Theater Pub.
We probably ran across each other at that point because. That was such a small venue, but that's so cool and so crazy how small of a world it is. And we got to talking when I was down there doing that testing, and then it just we were like, we need to record at least one podcast, and that was probably a few months ago at this point because I think that was before the Ironman World Championships and probably before I went to Europe. And so it's been a long time we've been discussing things, and what we want to really talk about is. And I'll let Chris go into a little bit more of his background for those of you who haven't heard of him, don't know him, in just a second. But we want to talk more about the integration of the science and art of coaching, because we both think that there is a need for a little bit more translational sort of discussions on this sort of stuff. The science needs to become a little bit more artistic. The artistic side of coaching needs to become a little bit more scientific, and there's probably some optimal, sort of coaching strategy in the middle. Yeah. Before we jump into that, actually, Chris, if you wouldn't mind, I actually don't even know all of your background, but giving people a little bit of your background would be awesome, just so we can learn a little bit more about you.
For sure. Yeah. So I've been doing this endurance stuff now for a little over 20 years. My first endurance event was a marathon in Washington, D.C. I had moved to D.C. after college. I was a goalkeeper in college. I played college soccer. And so I was the guy who stood in one place for 90 minutes. Mostly an anaerobic demand, goalkeeping. Lots of explosive stuff, quick movements, things like that. And yet every preseason when our coach had us run I think it's called the Cooper test. And it's 2 miles in under 12 minutes. Very basic soccer thing. I think he just prescribed it to us because he was a young coach himself. It's hilarious to think of that he was in his early 30s at this point.
And as a young coach, and he's just like, all right, guys, I need to see who's fit and who's not, so go run 2 miles. It's funny you say that because I think that has to be a ubiquitous test, preseason for high schoolers. Cause I had a few friends on the high school team and they did the exact same thing.
Which is kind of gnarly actually, when you're okay, I want without any preparation, ball sports kids, basically I need you to run 2 sub 6 minute miles, which is not nothing. Right. It's a real, it's sort of a head scratcher, but I'm a real rule follower. My coach sent us this kind of very basic training plan. He was like, well, you should probably run 3 miles in 7:30s and then maybe knock that down to 7:15s and just a good, I just did it. And every season I was one of 2 people who actually succeeded at the test. We're a bunch of Division III sensitive college soccer players, not really runners or endurance athletes. And so, I apparently had some talent for it. Got out of college, moved to Washington, D.C. I was working at a theater. And theaters usually at Mondays off. That's the only day of the week that you have off when you work at a theater, because you perform Tuesday through Sunday. You usually have 2 performances on Wednesdays and Sundays. So those are very long days. and your only day off is Monday, there are no adult soccer leagues in Washington, D.C. that play on Mondays, or there weren't in 2002. So I didn't like my job. I didn't really like Washington, D.C. I started running every morning. I signed up for a marathon. I ran a 3:11, my first marathon. So like,
nice.
Not bad. Like, okay, have a little bit of talent. Was like pretty gutted to miss qualifying for Boston in my first crack at
you're like, oh, my life is over. I didn't qualify for Boston on my first marathon attempt. I'm sure everybody does, like
the guy who was coaching me at the time was just like the head coach of this run group, and he was like, dude, that was amazing. And I was like, was it? So
it's funny because I think like with like the inexperience that you probably had at that point, you're just like, it's like, I don't know. Is this good? Is this bad? And like people who are actually like, kind of seasoned runners, like that is like one of the pinnacles is like, I'm going to qualify for Boston. And it's pretty challenging, especially for, like what would it be? Probably like, 20 to 35-year-old age group is what, like sub 3 hours?
I think it's sub 3 now. Yeah, it was 3:10 at the time, but I think it's 3 now, which is that's legit. Like you run a sub 3 marathon, like you're moving. But I grew up swimming, and at one point I bought a bike because I really hated DC. I really did not enjoy my time in DC, and so I bought a bike basically to escape. And then I think I was back in Maine for the summer, and somebody was like, "Hey, you swim, bike, and run. There's a triathlon tomorrow." I was at a contra dance. I was like out at a contra dance, and someone was like, "You should do this thing." And I was like, "Okay." And I think I signed up like hungover and, went and did it. And I was like, "I like this." Yeah. I was good enough to turn pro 3 years later. Promptly got my ass handed to me for the next 4 years. Like really was like, I turned pro way too fast. I would tell anybody in my position that if I met me now, I would be like, stay amateur longer. And that's especially true now because we're talking about 2006 when like times were not particularly fast. And these days, like a lot of fast amateurs are very, very fast. I mean, we're seeing amateurs in Kona in the low 8s, which is like remarkable.
It blows my mind. Like back when I did one Ironman in 2012, and like qualifying time, for that age group, which was again probably I don't know all the age groups off the top of my head, but like maybe 24 to 29, or maybe a little bit younger, whatever, 18 to 24. That's probably what it was that I was in. The qualifying time was like if you go under like 10, like if you're like 9:30 or something like that, and now it's like. It's like that's like okay, good job, bud. Like you might qualify for Kona, but there's no way you're gonna be, even in the top. I don't know, X amount of people for that. And it's amazing how much the sport has grown just in those. I guess it's been 10 years at this point. Yeah. But
with a real acceleration in the last 4 or 5 years. And that's, I mean, both of us have been in the endurance world long enough now that we can there's maybe a little like, I wonder what's going on there. But there is also, I do think there have been enough advances in, coaching and training and fueling. That really does seem to be the big one at the particular moment. But I raced professionally from 2006 to 2021. I probably had like actually 5 or 6 good years in the middle there, probably from like 2011 to 2016 or 17 was when I was actually racing effectively.
And what distance was this at the time?
I was mostly a half and full guy. I did one ITU race at the Westchester Triathlon in like 2008 or something. And it was so bad.
And you were like, holy shit, that was a shit show. There was drafting and it was, I can't even imagine how hectic, that.
Oh, I mean, I was dropped in the first 150 meters. I was out of I was out of the pack within 200 meters. Like, and like, I wasn't a bad triathlon swimmer. I was a middle of the pack triathlon swimmer, but I mean, like this is a fairly big race. There's probably 40 or 50 guys on the start line. Jared Shoemaker was there, and this is like right when Jared was really good. And I think I finished 10 minutes back. Wow.
Like,
it was a rough day. So yeah, I pretty quickly was like, okay, even non-draft Olympic distance was too fast. And there's a great coaching maxim out there. I've never seen somebody who wasn't fast get fast, which is true-ish. I do think that it is possible to make people who are not fast, but it's hard. It's that is probably one of the biggest coaching challenges. If you were to try to like take somebody who wasn't truly fast and get them to like a quick 800-meter speed, like take someone like me who is going to do repeat 800s in training at, 230, 240, something like that.
You could do those probably all day, right?
Yeah, that was fine. Like that's, and that's like that's your basic run of the mill ticket to play. If you wanted to be a professional endurance athlete 10 to 15 years ago. But taking someone like me from like a 230 800 to like a 205 800, I think that would be really interesting and also really, really, really difficult.
Yeah. I think being in like being part of like the track world and those sort of things, I think a lot of the times, there's an overprescription of intensity, especially in running. And I think that actually may hinder the ability to actually get fast. Because one of the things my high school coaches would do is, it's like they knew that we weren't really training over the winter because they didn't provide training plans and those sort of things. And it was like 3 days a week, high intensity interval training, for the first like 2 or 3 weeks of practice. And then they wonder why everyone's got IT band issues or broken feet or like other things like that. It was complete nonsense. And that's actually one of the reasons why I got eventually, into coaching and exercise physiology and those sort of things. Cause I just always felt let down by my coaches. Like, it's like you, if you hire a coach or you have a coach, you kind of trust them implicitly that they know what they're doing and know what they're talking about. But then when you're doing like 300 bicycles every single day after cross country practice, and you ask them, you're like, why are we doing this? And they're like, 'cause I said so. That's a really easy way to get interested individuals like uninterested in what you're actually doing. So I always wanted to figure out the why, and that's part of, the reasons why I developed the podcast and like, went on to do my master's and my Ph.D. and those sort of things. 'Cause I'm always interested in learning, like, well, why are we doing this? What's the optimal way of like going about it? And like those sort of things. And I'm sure the kind of like surge of, like really good or a lot better endurance athletes. Like I think everybody has started, it's like has gotten better because we're starting to actually apply scientific principles to training. And it's not like it's a little bit less like these camps of, oh, well, this is like the long, slow endurance camp, and this is like the interval camp, and this is like the other camp. And granted, there are still those camps out there, and there's still things on, Instagram and YouTube and all those things that are like, you have to do zone 2 training every single day to build your base. And I'm just like, no, because that is, we learned that a long time ago. And somebody I've really been following a lot lately is Steve Magnus, phenomenal, running coach. And, he's like, what can we learn from the history of the development of running and how people approach things? And, it's like, well, people used to do a shitload of endurance sort of stuff. And it was like to the tune of like 4-hour walks every day. And they would do walks. And then it swung all the way to high intensity interval training where every single day was some sort of, interval. And now we've kind of figured out, at least from a single modal sport like running or cycling or swimming, that you do 1, 2, maybe 3 workouts a week. And then the rest of that is kind of filled in with, more recovery style or volume building, sort of like zone 2, low fatigue building sort of things, because what you need to do is you need to facilitate recovery between those hard workouts in order to do those hard workouts harder, the next time. And, it's like, so we've gotten to that point, and that's, kind of, I think that's where the coaching does a really good job now. But the science, then, we're like, oh, block periodization is the way of improving VO2 max, or like other things. And then you never, it's not a nuanced discussion of like, well, this was actually just a 5-week study, and this showed that VO2 max improved, as opposed to being like, yeah, this probably wouldn't be sustainable for 99% of the population. Yeah. And that's why we're here to talk about this.
I mean, I could respond to like so many things that you just brought up, Yeah. I mean, especially the high school running thing. I was just down in California at a friend's house for Thanksgiving, and their son has gotten into rowing, but he's also like, he's a high schooler. He's a freshman in high school. And so he was like, yeah, I'm not going to do the like winter rowing conditioning like block, because it's his choice. It's high school. Yeah. We can't like, and honestly, like, the drive in this country to get kids to do the same sport 12 months in a row is a really misguided impulse. And I'm stoked that my friend's son is like, no, I want to, he's like, I want to play soccer this winter. I want to like hang out with my friends and stuff like that. And, but he was telling me, we were just like chatting. I was like, well, what's like your, what's like a strength workout look like for you? I was like, are you doing many crunches? Because you probably shouldn't. And he was like, oh, we do hundreds of crunches every day. And then he was like, we usually do them in a gravel parking lot. And I was like, oh my God. And I was like, does your coach say things like, it's uncomfortable, but this will like toughen you up? And he's like, oh yeah. And I was like, and I've got some I used to be a high school English teacher, and like, when you teach at independent schools, you are also, like soccer coach and all this other stuff. And you're thrown into these situations where you really don't have any experience at all. And so like, yeah, I'm sure that when I was 25 and coaching the girls soccer team, that I was like, sure, we're going to do a whole bunch of crunches, like, and not realizing or not understanding, because how would I, that like the human spine has a finite number of flexions that is like given to it in its life cycle. And you would prefer to not exceed that number of flexions before you are dead. Because when you do exceed that number of flexions, it's a herniated disc or something bad.
Is that actually like backed by, some sort of scientific report thing? Because I'm like I'm sure it's highly dependent person to person. And I mean, like that. But
like it's one of those truisms where it's like, yes, this is true, and B, there's also no way to track it per person.
Right. That's why I had to ask. I'm like,
so the thing is you're like, well, so maybe we just don't do crunches. Like, because, and this is sort of like the discussion we're about to have is like, the problem that I see, like both of our camps, I'm predominantly a coach who has to understand some physiology in order to do my job. You're predominantly a physiologist who coaches. And so we have this like wonderful crossover, but I think one of the things that frustrates me about the coaching side and other coaches is a real misunderstanding of like what a population level study is versus what an N of 1 means. And like, coaches are doing N's of 1 with each of their athletes. Every athlete you have is a study subject with an N number of 1. And if you don't read a bunch of journals, an N of 1 just means there is one subject. And in the scientific world, that means that study is useless.
It's called a case study.
Great. Okay, so that's where that term comes from. That's amazing. That's so funny. You would think, so my experience of case study is like, oh, that has to be a law term. But now I can see why that would be an actual like science term, is that it's a single case study. And so when we're talking about this like spinal flexion thing, you're totally correct, where you're like, how would you do a longitudinal study that proves that?
Yeah.
You can't. But we do know that like there is sort of like, it is completely athlete dependent when your spine is going to give out. Mm-hmm. But then the answer is like, well, what are we doing with a crunch in the first place? Like, what's the goal? And I think that's what you're talking about when talking about your high school coaching, is that like what your coaches were probably doing was just what they had done, or like what had been done to them.
Yeah. So I can actually kind of speak a little bit to this. So one of the coaches had lost a bunch of weight by doing, some, I don't know, like workout program or something like that. So I imagine one of the workout programs had a lot of crunches in there. She didn't even have a running background or anything like that. But it's like, oh yeah, how hard is it to actually coach running? You just run more and then you get better. That's probably, again, I don't know what her actual thinking on this was, but that's like how I, kind of like envisioned and received, the coaching from them. And then the other coach, he actually did have, like, he was a pretty decent runner, in high school. I don't know if he actually ran college. But so he had a little bit of background, when the high school used to be good, but it was one of those things he had us doing, like the stupid workout of like, 20 by 400s, or like,
you just
like,
read Once a Runner.
Yeah. This was before Once a Runner. This was before Once a Runner, but it was something similar to that, where it was like, yep, like a few weeks before, it's like, we're going to do 20 by 400 because that's what, Bob Fernandez did. And, I don't know, that's not his real name, but, like back in the day, and that's how he got so good. And it's like, I going to like, that the N of one, I think it's really important that a coach do N of one studies with each of their athletes, because you don't know how an athlete's going to respond to whatever the stimulus is. We know, and you can see this in the research too, is like if you do a VO2 max study where you're just trying to improve somebody's VO2 max, almost every single time, granted your population is high enough, you have responders, which are the people who improve their VO2 max. You have non-responders, which are the people who don't change, and then you have negative responders, which are actually the people who go down. And what you need to do then as a coach, if you're reading, like literature, is you need to say, okay, like overall, there was a positive benefit to VO2 max. So if I'm going to try to improve my athlete's VO2 max, maybe we try something like this, because we've identified, hey, this individual has to improve their VO2 max, but just know they could be in any one of those three fields. So if at the end of that, training block, their VO2 max has not gotten better, it's probably because the stimulus was not appropriate for that individual. So as an N of one, now as a coach, you can tweak that and you say, okay, now we change it. So it's like, so that's really the approach I think people should be taking, is like, what do we learn from the literature and what are the outcomes from that? How does this potentially apply to the individual I'm coaching? And then how can we just like, test that on the N of one basis? Yeah.
And I think the impasse that we see all the time between coaches and physiologists, I mean, it's this like, this happens in kind of every aspect of not just American culture, but particularly American culture right now, with like polarization of everything. And I think the reason that we end up in these different sort of dogmatic camps, where physiologists, will do a study and they'll be like, well, this is how this is done. But a physiologist isn't working in the kind of environment where they're trying to make individual athletes better. Like what a physiologist is doing when they publish a paper is trying to keep their job. Like that's the primary thing. That is
one of the main factors for sure.
Yeah. And I think people don't get that, like that the reason that like I come from an academic background in the literature side of things, and you end up with dissertations that are like representations of, sociological merchantism in 17th century poetry in Britain, and like it seems completely like arcane and esoteric. And the point is that when you're in an academic setting, is you sort of have to make a name for yourself by doing something different. And then what happens is that like because people don't have the time to read deeply or read thoroughly, the sound bites of the study title work their way into the coaching landscape. And people don't have the approach that you're talking about, where it's like, okay, I'm going to read this study. Oh, there are respondents, non-respondents, and negative responders. I am going to look at the protocol.
Yep. That's also super important.
It's a very important step.
Yeah.
And try to figure out how I would apply a version of that protocol to some of my athletes, and then figure out if it's going to work or not based on the results. But I think what happens is that, you know, one person is like, well, let's just do Ronstadt 3015s. Or in another case, Ronstadt 3015s are terrible, you know, not because there's anything wrong with 3015s, but because the way the study is set up in such a way that it's sort of specious reasoning. And I bring up the 3015 study because like 3015s probably are a good VO2 max intervention, but the way that particular study was written, they were comparing 30-15 intervals with sweet spot intervals.
Oh, those are the types of nuances and stuff like that you have to look at, right? Because a sweet spot interval is inherently a lower intensity than a 30-15, which is going to be probably closer to VO2 max. So you would expect individuals who do 30-15s to get more stimulus on VO2 max compared to sweet spot interval, and then you're just like, like. And I will say this. I will say that I don't think that, you know, academics are like publishing papers purely, you know, just to survive and you know,
totally.
like save their jobs, for example, right? It's most of the time people who are in research, like you got to love the shit out of what you're doing in order to stay doing it, because it is a very kind of a thankless job in a sense, at least from what I've experienced. So I always trust that, you know, researchers are doing the best that they can.
Yeah.
And what I think is really interesting, because you said, oh, well, a lot of times people take the sound bites. And the first thing, there was a study that was done a few years ago that got picked up by the New York Times. And it was like, oh, is too much high intensity interval training bad for your mitochondria or bad for your metabolic health? And there was the last time I looked, but I think before comments got turned off, there was like 3,000 comments or something like that. And it just absolutely blew up. And I even commented on it because I was just like, look, like we want to encourage more exercise to be done. This was a cool study, but what they did, and I can't remember the exact protocol that they used, but it was like they did, you know, like a rest period where they took, you know, muscle biopsies, and then they did a standard training, you know, sort of intervention for a week. And then they just did an overload week where they did, I think it was every day. In the morning they did like 4 by 8 minutes on, 4 minutes off. So, you know, pretty standard like cycling VO2 max workout. Yep. And then in the afternoon they came back and did another VO2 max workout. So like it was ridiculously challenging. Like I'm surprised they even got anybody to like get through the actual study, to be honest. And then they looked at, you know, like, oh, well, how well is your glucose regulated? How well is your, you know, mitochondrial function and other things like that? And everything decreased, essentially.
Well, yeah,
like,
of course, because they were dying.
Yeah. So you're like, oh shit, like these people were in, you know, like this was like inputting so much stress on the human body. But then what they did is they had somebody, they took them back to normal training, and pretty much every marker rebounded. But what didn't rebound was like, you know, glucose control or something along those lines. So then the takeaway is like, oh, is it bad for your metabolic health? It's like, yeah, no shit, that, you know, doing, what did I say, 10 VO2 max workouts a week is probably not going to be the best, you know, because you are just going to be damaging yourself so damn bad. But this is like, you know, but this is, again, it's going to be interesting because we're probably speaking to audiences who are so like pretty educated, actually can, you know, interpret research, you know, pretty well, like those sort of things. And, you know, so I think it's like kind of our job to talk about this and then help educate more people so then they can talk about it and then go out, you know, further and further and further. Because I still see, you know, studies that are just like, oh, well, you know, block periodization, you know, like there was a new study that came out that was like, they did like, I can't remember the whole thing, but they just did like a week of block periodization and then like, you know, some breaks. And the other group did, you know, something along the lines of like, and it was block periodization for VO2 max training. And then the other group did one VO2 max training, you know, session per week, maybe two. And what they found was that the block periodization improved, you know, markers of VO2 max, you know, like speed or power output at 4 millimole, roll my eyes, and, you know, some measure of like, you know, time trial performance more so than the other group. But the other group also improved, which is also something that, you know, was not mentioned. And you're like, well, okay, so maybe there is something to say about just something that is consistently done over time. And this gets back to, you know, the connection of like, yeah, for coaching, there is no coach, or it's very rare that a coach would prescribe block periodization for an individual. And if they do, it's like a week, maybe two, with a boatload of recovery afterwards.
Yeah.
And I was talking to one of the physiologists up at Nike, and he was like, yeah, I'm working with this athlete, and we think they might need, you know, like a little bit of block periodization. So, you know, it's like, I typically don't recommend that, but if they want to do it, then we'll do it for a week or two, and then we'll do, you know, then we'll see if they improved, and then we'll go from there. So, so that's like the type of thinking that you should be, you know, implementing and implying, you know, when you're trying to take that research and then make it truly applicable. But, you know, a lot of I get so many questions about like, you know, oh, should I do double threshold days in the Norwegian method? And like my question always back is like, well, why do you want to do that?
Right.
And then, you know, typically the response is, well, you know, they're doing it, so why shouldn't I doing it? And shouldn't I be doing it? And then I also ask, okay, well, how much mileage are you doing? What you know, what else are you doing? That's like, because it's not just double threshold days that are important. It's like, you know, it's all about the why of the workout. And, you know, I think like a really good coach should be able to describe on any given day what the purpose of the workout is. Yeah. If you don't, if you have a coach that can't do that and just says, because I said so, run. And I'm not saying run the workout. I'm saying get the hell away from them, because like if they don't have a reason for it, and if they haven't made a conscious thought process about that, then I don't trust that they are, you know, prescribing this with my best interest at heart. Yeah. It's just like, so that's me. And that's why
I think, yeah, I mean, like what we're talking about is nuance, you know, a nuanced approach to not just coaching, but also to researching. And like, you know, I have like, you know, the reason I bring up the kind of publish or perish thing is just to remind, not that like, you know, researchers are cynical or they're not interested in like development and all that stuff. Like, it is a very thankless job, and you're sort of like the tip of the spear in terms of human learning. Like, that's what researchers do. Like, the whole point of research science is to expand the breadth of human information. And that is a wonderful task. It is not necessarily pertinent to the one athlete that you're coaching. And so the only reason I bring it up is more of a cautionary tale for coaches, you know, not for physiologists, because like we need physiologists. Like we cannot do our job without it. Because what physiologists do is they bring new ideas into the coaching arena. And then a lot of the time, I think the relationship that really could happen and doesn't happen as much as it could is coaches experimenting with what they see physiologists doing, actually documenting it in a sensible way, which, you know, like that's its own thing. That's like a skill that I think a lot of coaches aren't even like conscious of. And then actually aggregating or integrating both sides of the equation. Like, that's why this is why like our relationship is pretty cool, is because both of us can understand the other person's world and visits that world. Right. But we're actively working in that other realm. And so like, you know, the like what you were saying about like, okay, you could do a block period of VO2 max training, but it also still works if you're doing just 1 or 2 sessions a week. I don't know if you listened to the Rich Roll episode recently with the guy that won Leadville, David Roche, I think.
Yeah. I haven't listened to it, but I've heard, I've read some articles about David Roach and his approach to, training and stuff.
You and I were talking a few weeks ago about that other meta-analysis that came out this fall about like what is the best way to train. And that study, that meta-analysis, that's not actually what it set out to discover.
Right.
It set out to do a meta-analysis, which that's the thing is when you're doing a meta-analysis, you are aggregating a shit ton of studies and then trying to come up with okay, you're more studying the studies rather than coming up with what is the big direction that we take out of this?
Right.
And I think from that study, what you and I kind of talked about and laughed about, and also with the David Roche thing is what appears to be the answer is a well-balanced menu of most different energy systems.
Yeah.
and put out in a pretty sensible and thoughtful way, depending on what you want to do with that individual athlete. And I think that's the breakdown. This is why AI coaching is so frustrating to me, and AI in general, and this is why I wanted to talk about the difference between a population level study and a case study. AI works at the population level.
Yes.
Coaching has to operate at the case study level. And so if you were trying to coach an athlete with an AI platform, you're just getting the average of everything that has ever happened.
And I would say, we're talking, I hope people aren't, interpreting this as us ragging on both sides of things, because that is absolutely not. We live in both of these communities and we want both of them to be better. And we think that by merging and communicating better these sort of, topics and educating people, it's both sides of the coin. We can make, truly better athletes. And that's what I think is what we're trying to get at, is we want the individual in front of you, in front of me, in front of Chris, to be the best athlete that they can possibly be, whether they're running an ultra marathon or doing an 800 meter, right? That is, and we think that there's valuable lessons to be learned from all of this. And this is why it's so fun, for me and Chris to talk about this, is because we do have these different, lenses with which we do view, like athletes and individualization of our coaching. But I think we also agree that individualization of the coaching is important for improvement of these athletes. And what I will say about the AI thing is that I've tried one of the one of the AI platforms, and it's based on your genes, based on who you are, or who, quote unquote, who you are, this is what you should be doing, this is what you should be doing. And it very, very, very promptly, because of some what I believe are assumptions, if that's a word, misassumptions in terms of heart rate based zoning, was prescribed a threshold workout that was really a VO2 max workout, and immediately hurt my Achilles tendons. Because both of them, and it wound up resulting in me being injured for the next months. It was multiple months of injury, because there was no questions in the initial thing of, do you have, any underlying injury? Have you, ever had issues with this? It was just, based off of our population and how you answered our questionnaire, here's what we think, should work. And this is where a trained coach actually does come in, because you get the training plan created via AI, but then the coach knows the questions to ask, or should know the questions to ask. Hey, have you had an injury? Bad injury rates. What's your stress level like? Oh, have you ever done any blood work? Oh shit, your vitamin D and your testosterone are like relatively low most of the time. Okay, so we probably don't want to do a lot of high intensity stuff, because that's going to result in potential challenges with recovery and other things like that. How are your eating patterns? Do you eat enough? Are you stressed? Do you have high anxiety? There's if you can't notice, those are all things that are like impact my life pretty much right now. And because you can't get that nuance of conversation, that personal connection, those sort of things, that is one of the big, very, very big challenges with like AI coaching. And it's like, you can't just have an individual come on, to be coached, and you just like type into your little AI coaching app and then it just spits it out and you just don't do anything from there. Like, you can't do that. You're going to have a lot of athletes get injured. You're going to have a lot of athletes that are going to drop you. And we're probably not talking to those types of coaches, but that's also this individualized approach to coaching really takes a lot of time and effort. Yeah. And unfortunately, I don't think a lot of athletes value that to the extent that it makes it, not even lucrative, but like enough to get paid to have, like a comfortable living. Unless you have tons of athletes. But then if you have tons of athletes, then you can't be as individualized. So it's this crazy, economic conundrum as well, that kind of plays into why people haven't adopted this like more individualized approach. Because I imagine if you talk to most coaches, they'd be like, oh yeah, like that's absolutely what you have to do. But in all practicality, it may not be there. Yeah.
Let's see, so as a way to illustrate this example, if I say to you 95% of a 20-minute all-out test, how do you feel about that statement?
Again, that's like very... I know that's how some people interpret FTP to be determined. And
what's wrong with that? Why is that problematic?
Well, because it doesn't work for everybody, right? That's the problem is like, there's some people who are really, really good at putting out 20-minute efforts, but it's also forgetting like a very key component to how that was prescribed and who it was prescribed to. I'm pretty sure it was prescribed to like high level cyclists, or if not,
it was descriptive of a professional population.
Yeah. So there's number one.
Right.
Then there was also an all-out 5-minute effort before that in the initial sort of testing thing with, I think, a 10-minute rest or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And then it was,
blowout interval.
Yeah. Because what they were looking for is they're looking for that maximal sustainable power that is like purely oxidative. So if that sounds familiar, that's like critical power as it's described in the literature, which, like there's ways of determining that, but it's again, like that has been leaned on by a lot of people. And then people get frustrated when they're like, oh yeah, like 95% of my 20-minute is 300 watts. So I should be able to do that for an hour. It's like, good luck unless you're a, professional, triathlete.
Yeah. There's like so many, there's so many like misconceptions like built into that whole thing. First of all, that you can even hold like FTP for an hour, and you've already brought up the 4 millimoles thing. Like, why is that so infuriating for us? Like, what you might have to back up, and I'm sure most of our listeners understand what context that's in. But like, why is that such similar to the FTP thing? Why is that such a useless metric?
Yeah. So let me take a step back to the FTP thing real quick too. Is like, and this is I've had a lot of really good discussions with Dave Schell, who's also been on the Critical Oxygen podcast, and he sends me all of these things because he was really involved with Training Peaks for a while, and
that's right,
of course they're all like they've used a lot of Coggins stuff, and one of the definitions of FTP is like what you can maintain for 60 minutes in a quasi semi semi-quasi steady state, something like that. Semi-quasi
and quasi.
I know it might it might have just been one of those. I just wanted to add more, for you as the English major.
It's a quarter.
Yeah.
What is quasi like? Is that a?
But that's like, so that was like Hagen's definition. And, so then it's like, okay, well, the best way to actually test that would just be to do a 60-minute all-out test. But also, it's like where coaching kind of has to go sometimes is you have to figure out what's time efficient for people.
Totally.
So this is where the 2095 came from. But unfortunately, and this is where like I think physiological testing is like one of the most valuable things you can do if you're like, and doing it regularly. So if you have the opportunity, like this is what I've been doing with all of my training is like after every block, I take a down week with physiological testing, and I want to know how my numbers are changing. And it's important, because just doing, like your 20-minute FTP test and then basing all of your zones on that, you guys would be surprised at how many people I have tested and those percentages do not work.
Oh my God.
Like
I'd say most don't work. Most of the time it doesn't work.
Yeah. Or like the 220 minus your age, which I think most people have gone away from now. But even then, like if you get max heart rate and then do 10% down, it's like, it just doesn't match up. Like some people, it's crazy. Some people are at, 40% of their watt max for their zone 2.
Yep.
Other people are at like 75%, that would be really, really high, but like 75% of their watt max. And then there's everybody in between. And then same thing with second threshold. So this is it's all down to the individualization of things. And I know, we're being persnickety about this like individualization and those sort of things, because what I will say is that something is better than nothing most of the time.
Yeah.
It's probably, using 20% or 95% of 20-minute as your FTP and then prescribing from there is probably not adversely affecting a lot of people.
Yeah.
But the problem is it's not the most efficient and it's not the most optimal.
Yeah.
So that's also, something that we have to be aware of as coaches is like, well, what's the most optimal for the athlete? And you can't just simply prescribe more volume or, more of this or more of that, because there's ultimately time limits, that the athlete has. Like they have lives. Like, most people aren't fortunate enough to be, like a professional athlete who just can just train and eat and train more. So we have to be,
even most professionals can't live that way. A very tiny percentage of professional athletes live that professional athlete kind of dream.
Yeah. And even then that's hard. Like, I was
very boring.
I listened to things about like Kristian Blummenfelt. Like he's just built different. Like let's just be honest here. Like so choosing him as like the person to emulate. Like don't first and foremost. But like he is the type of guy that's just like he wants to do. Like he wants to see what those limits are, and he is willing to train 30 hours a week. There was a case study on him that just came out that was like 30 hours a week, and he was burning like 8,000 calories a day or some insane amount of calories. And it's like, and people are going to see this and they're going to be like, oh my gosh, the limits of the human body, and they're going to think that they can do it. And it's like, no.
Yeah.
He is a special human being. Yeah. Like, and the group that he has surrounded himself with are special individuals who are individualizing everything for him. So keep that in mind when you read these, like the Norwegian method book and the Norwegian method, stuff is like all of that. You have to take into the bigger picture what the context of all of this actually is. And ultimately it comes down to individualization. And now let's get to the 4 millimolar stuff, because the Norwegians do use lactate,
which is another like great like another great discussion about context. I think that's pretty much what we're going to be talking about today is context. But yeah, please illuminate the rest of the world what the problem with 4 millimoles is. Like what's your? I think you have a similar beef with 4 millimoles that I do about 95% of 20 minutes all out. And quick little side note, Andy Coggan, incredibly smart. But he was a physiologist. Again, like he wasn't aiming to work in terms of like this kind of coaching thing. He was mostly describing a population. He was arriving at like, oh, this is what this population, again, of professional cyclists can do. And somewhere along the way, this got turned into, hey, Joe, this is what you should do.
Yes.
And I think that's probably the big thing we're talking about today is how do we know the difference between something that can be done and something that should be done. And
I will say too, if you read those papers that Coggan did publish, like if you actually can find them, like it is much more measured in terms of the way it's talked about and the confidence by which he is saying, oh, this works, who this works for. And that's, like that is how most researchers write. Yeah. Is they say, well, it depends. It's context specific. You have to like, this is who it applies to. It could apply over here. But we need to do more research. Like that is like the one of the best ways to pick out someone who is actually an expert in their field is how many times they say could, would, or it depends. Like
more research is necessary.
Yeah, and the more they say it, probably the more you should probably trust what they're saying, because we live in a world where there's that Dunning-Kruger effect. Man, holy shit! Everyone is living on top of Dunning-Kruger Mountain, and everyone is like, this is the way to do it. This is the way to do it based on like this one mouse study that had, like ends of 5 or something like that. And then, if you actually talk to like the researcher who did it, they probably wouldn't be confident saying that.
Or they wouldn't go out on that limb for sure.
No,
they would be like, no, please.
They're like, whoa, like we need to have caveat after caveat here. And, so that's, yes, we are talking about why context matters. And I don't know all of the particulars about the 2 and the 4 millimolar, but it was derived from a group of German exercise physiologists. One of the names is Maher, Maher, and they were doing something similar to how Coggan was doing FTP, where they were taking, I'm pretty sure it was high-level cyclists through progressive exercise intensity tests. So graded exercise test, VO2 max test, whatever you want to call it. And they were measuring lactate values at each of those or between each of those stages. And what they found was that the first inflection point in lactate was pretty close to 2 millimole. And I don't know at the time, like how precise their measurements could be. Like, is it 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5? I don't know.
Because we're also talking, this is the 80s.
It was a while ago.
Yeah.
And so they noticed, first threshold was at 2 millimole, and then second threshold was at 4 millimole. And
because great, we're done. Let's go to the bar. We're all good.
No, and that's exactly what happened. Now that people are trying to use lactate more and more, because there's been bigger discussions of, like this professional cycling team uses it. The Norwegian method uses it pretty extensively. And I think what it comes down to is lactate is a very, very complicated molecule that is being, produced, uptaken, oxidized, and used for resynthesis of glucose within the liver, and it's being uptaken by all these different tissues, and its dynamics are highly, highly, I would say, volatile based on the exercise intensity that you're doing, and by just measuring one time point at the end of a single step and then calling that close enough to measure like zones, just kind of blows my mind. Everyone's like, oh, well, we want, like a continuous lactate meter. I can guarantee you when we get those, people are going to lose their shit because it's going to be way more complicated than just, well, it's rising like we would expect it to. Because this is the challenge I run into with NIRS, with working with Moxy, is we give you real-time muscle oxygen data and how that is changing over time. So if SMO2 starts at 60, goes down to 59, 58, 57, if you have a negative slope, you're probably accumulating lactate.
Right.
But lactate is easier, quote unquote, easier to understand because it's just one number in a given interval. It's an average. You know, it's like you're essentially just saying, well, that's the average of the interval in a sense.
Right.
But I had I'm working with this runner out of Northern Kentucky University. He's a super smart kid, and he's doing his lactate stuff, and he really wants to, you know, like kind of use it to the best of his ability. I'm like, hey man, if we're gonna do this, we're gonna do this. So he did his own lactate test on a treadmill, you know, like in the athlete area. And it's like I'm just like, holy shit, dude, like you're taking this to the next level. And he sent me, you know, his graph, and his first inflection point was at like 1.4 millimole. And like, so the reason why I say that is like, I'm looking for inflection points in physiology because those mean more to me than just a number. And if we would have measured, so his first inflection point, I believe, is at 1.4. His second inflection point was probably at like 2.4 or 2.5. So maybe 3. It wasn't that high.
Yeah.
But if we would have used 2 and 4, we would have been overestimating all of his exercise intensities going forward. Whereas now we know where those inflection points are, and we can kind of have a good starting point for where his exercise intensity should be, given if we're going to do a zone 2 workout or run, or a threshold workout or run, or the double threshold Norwegian method sort of things, where we actually kind of determined what range that we're aiming for based on a given speed, based on that curve. And then I only have him exercise until he gets up to that point. So we modulate the length of the interval to get him to that range every single time. And I think that's really the value of lactate. Like most of the time I say, hey, don't really use lactate, guys. There's a lot of other things out there that we can get zones, and you learn a lot from. But because he doesn't have access to those, lactate is the thing that we're using. You just have to be individualized with it. And, you know, it's like I would never recommend to him, oh, well, what did the Norwegians aim for? Oh, 2.5 and 3.5 for their, you know, thousands, and then their, you know, 200s that are a little faster. It's like, no, that's just one guy who said that's where he came to the conclusion of. So that's where, you know, that's where I get fired up and I roll my eyes, is because, you know, it's like 4 millimole could be, like if you have a low fat or a low carb, high fat individual, they may never get above 4.
Yeah.
Just because they do not eat very many carbohydrates. Lactate is derived from the breakdown of carbohydrates. Yeah. So I also had an individual reach out to me on Instagram, and she was like, yeah, I did a lactate test and they said I don't have a second threshold. I was like,
you're either like, that's either amazing or you should go to the hospital.
I was like, wait a minute. They said you don't have a second threshold. How is that even possible? She was like, well, my lactate never got above 4. And I was like, whoa, let's take a step back here. And this is again, I get mad at coaches who don't individualize, and I get mad at, you know, people in the lab who don't use their problem solving skills to be like, oh, well, maybe that's not correct because this individual went all the way to failure.
Right.
And you're telling me she doesn't have a second threshold. Like, that is like completely asinine in my opinion. Like,
just keep doing what you're doing. You're doing fine. You're not above your threshold yet.
No.
Just like in this athlete,
you have to keep going. She's like falling off the treadmill like face first. Dude, so this is like, and you know, so this is where I'm like, okay, well, let's actually understand, what does second threshold mean? Well, it's the tipping point between sustainable and unsustainable exercise intensity, meaning that at the, you know, on the easier end of things, you should be able to maintain that for a fairly long period of time. Yeah. On the other side of things, it's fatigue is going to happen. Yeah. And, you know, whether that's in 30 minutes or in 2 minutes depends on how high above that threshold you're actually going.
Yeah.
First threshold's a little squishier just because it is we're trying to detect very, very small changes, right, in physiology, and we still don't 100% know, I would say, like what's actually causing. Some people say it's recruitment pattern, from predominantly type 1 fibers to more type 2A fibers. There's it could be a shift in carbohydrate and fat oxidation, which is then related to type 2 or like more fiber type recruitment and those sort of things. But the bottom line is you have to know what they mean, and then you can start to think, oh, well, if this individual is going to failure, obviously there was some, she was above her sustainable, pace, her highest sustainable pace. So then what you can do is then you can take and you can just draw the curve on the lines. Like It's like I can almost guarantee you it's not just going to be linearly increasing. And if it is, then you got to use other values to actually determine where those thresholds are. But most likely it stayed really low for a little while, and then it bumped up a little bit, and then it bumped up even faster, and then she failed.
And then she was done.
But the bottom line is she was trying to lose weight. She was on a high fat diet. And, most of the stuff she was doing, I believe, if I can remember correctly, was like, she was, just doing a lot of like zone 2 running and stuff like that. So it's like, all of those things add up to being like, she probably didn't get her lactate over 4 millimole just simply because she was so depleted from trying to lose weight and eating very low amounts of carbohydrate.
And what's such a bummer about that situation is that, like, without a nuanced approach or a nuanced like interpretation of those results, like that athlete could end up out there training on their own, completely wrecking their metabolic health. And like that's one of the things that really that worries me about our sort of endurance landscape, is that like we're deeply invested too overly much in probably like single data points, and like not invested enough, like you're saying, in testing more often, and also finding other markers to help us corroborate what we're trying to do. So it's like, and then, so like this particular athlete like hasn't done very much high intensity training from what you're saying. And
at least from what I remember.
And so, of course, like whenever it ticked up above like moderately hard, like physiologically, she is at capacity. She's at maximum. And so like I bet that test went like moderate, hard, impossible.
Yeah.
And then the lab person is like, oh, well, man, you don't have a second threshold. And it's like, no, you do, but you guys weren't paying attention.
Yeah.
And it's that athlete is going to be so much better served by, you take that, you get that lactate test. And then you have a coach that's like, hey, let's try some more carbohydrates. And then hey, can you tell me like roughly what heart rate you're at when you can start hearing your breathing? And then like, hey, can you also tell me when your breathing gets like gaspy? Like, I mean, a good coach and a good researcher are essentially detectives. But I think that researchers are operating, you're trying to figure out what is happening with 1,000 people. In a dream study where you actually have, where you're like actually like well funded and shit like that. And a coach is trying to figure out like, okay, what's happening with this one person. But what worries me is I don't think that physiologists and coaches are talking enough that like we can be like, okay, here's how you should interpret that study for an individual athlete. And then also when you're looking at an individual athlete, like their results of whatever they're doing doesn't just make them fit neatly into a population as well. Like it does have to be this like very, very nuanced, like you're saying, you just have to be like, okay, tell me about the test. Tell me about the protocol. Tell me about what you ate. Tell me about like, what was the weather like that day? And it's about like trying to navigate this difference between researchers who are discovering new information and then applying that information to our case studies of one, like that's where this relationship could be so useful. That's how this could be a really powerful thing.
Yeah, I agree. I think, like I wrote down here, communication, right? It's communication between, the coaches, the athletes, and I think there's kind of two levels of what I would call researchers, is researchers doing the primary research literature studies, and then physiologists in labs who are doing N of 1 physiology testing. And this is a gap in knowledge, or a gap in translation, that I feel like I've been trying to tackle, is when you do a physiology test, it's not simply like, oh, well, your VO2 max is 65. That's great. Your second threshold is this. That's average. Your first threshold is this. That's shit. It's, okay, well, now what do we do with that data and those numbers? And that's like the way that I coach athletes, and I coach myself, and I coach my fiance, is we look at what the results of that physiological testing is, whether you're doing a 1 minute step on a VO2 max test, or you're doing a broken, 3-1 test to do, limiter assessment and those sort of zones and stuff like that. It doesn't really matter. You can still glean the same information. Is you say, okay, well, if we're building a house and that house is your physiology, the roof is the top, the second floor is your second threshold, and the first floor is your first threshold, ultimately. And, granted, this is oversimplification, because you still have economy, strength, neuromuscular drive, mental, sort of psychological sort of things, all that play into performance. But I'm just trying to do the best with the information that I'm gathering. And I'll give, just a walkthrough of like how I've been doing it with myself. So, for example, do a VO2 max test, and I was telling you about this. I did the 5 minute all out, and that's how I measure my VO2 max, because I found that that's all. It's kind of fun to do. It's like very type B fun, capital type B fun.
And it's sort of like
the highest VO2 max.
Which is worse, the 3 minute or the 5 minute? And people will just talk forever about which of those is actually. Oh, I think this is so funny. This is so funny. 3 minutes is worse for me. But you and I have talked about this, because we actually know our sort of physiological, why we're different physiological animals, and but okay, yeah, keep going.
Yeah. So figure my VO2 max out from the 5 minute test, and then I essentially do a 3-1 step test, and I can figure out, where my first threshold is and where my second threshold is. And, so then what I determine is, well, what percentage, where is my roof compared to my first floor and my second floor? Yeah. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to move all of those up and keep them, fairly equally spaced, I would say. Yeah. So, for example, if your second threshold is really high, but your VO2 max is too low, and your second threshold is running into that, then that's an obvious. You probably should make your VO2 max higher if you want to get better.
This is my department. This is where I live. A fairly limited VO2 max with a completely maxed out threshold. My second floor is a crawl space. I have a massive first floor, and then that space, it's like a B and John Malkovich. My area between my threshold and my VO2 max is pathetic. It's because I hate VO2 max training. I really don't enjoy that.
But then the question becomes, okay, well, what are you actually training for? Yeah. And what is the ultimate goal? So for me, I'm training for a race. It's 2,500 feet of elevation gain in a little over 2.5 miles, something like that. So the fastest, it's going to be brutal. The fastest that's ever done it is this. he's this guy, Joseph Gray, who has I'm pretty sure every record in Colorado Springs for trail running. He is just absolutely incredible. So he ran 37.5 minutes. Which is really, really fast. I don't think anyone else has broken 40. So the race, depending on how I do and how well I can stay, trained, is going to be probably between 40 and 50 minutes, depending on how I'm feeling that day. So my second threshold is going to be really, really important for that race.
Yes.
But that race isn't until May. So right now, even though my VO2 max, I would say, is actually pretty high, one thing that we discussed is like, well, your VO2 max is high, but your power output at VO2 max is actually pretty low. And what that means to me is something is happening where I'm not translating that oxygen consumption into mechanical power.
Right.
So this is how I am training in this block right at the very moment. I am trying to lengthen the amount of time and the amount of reps that I'm doing my VO2 max workouts at. So my first stage, first thing, just trying to get back into training, I was doing I have a hill right back here that I just talked about. It's 5 minutes to the top, and then I jog 5 minutes back down, and it's 20% grade. It's awesome because it's going to be very similar to the race that I'm doing. And I started with 2 reps, and now I'm up to 3 reps. And what I do, or again, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to accumulate time at or near VO2 max in order to get that power output up, in order to get that. It's not actually economy because it's not a steady state, but essentially have that VO2 max actually be commensurate with a power output, especially on the bike that is, a little bit more what we would expect, for example. And
there's a hole. At the moment, you have sort of a hole in your power duration curve. We would look at your power duration curve and be like, oh, there's a divot here. This is very clearly a place where and then, what we would try to figure out is this a problem? Is this a data problem? Is this we're just not collecting the right time signature? Or is it a true weakness where it's no, your that power range is actually a real physiological weakness for you. And then trying to train that in order to actually shore up what you're trying to do. What I think is really interesting though, is I think what a lot of people are going to hear when they heard your description, what I think happens is, so you've done a really nice job of outlining the demands of the event, which is a threshold based demand event. But then in your training description, you're I'm basically running in a very specific environment at VO2 max, trying to extend my time at VO2 max. The place where the breakdown happens between coaches, physiologists, and athletes, I think a lot of people are going to hear that and hear, oh, so he's just going to keep adding intervals until he's to 40 to 45 minutes. And you're no, that would be awful. And so it's just this really interesting thing of yes, we can use specific settings and specific intensities. That's crucial, but the goal is not always specificity. Because so you're trying to alter your house. And you're using very specific interventions to alter that house. You are not making your workouts look like the race in order to make the race easier, though that might actually be the end result.
Right. So it's a little bit of a combination, because I am lucky enough that, I have a hill that is similar to that, but where I'm going with this is the workouts are eventually going to turn from something that is equal parts work rest ratio, which we know is important for improving VO2 max, because you can work really, really hard and then you rest and then you work really, really hard again. You get up to that actual exercise intensity. Yep. I'm going to slowly, once I kind of, cap out that the VO2 max workouts, and I don't know exactly where I'm going to cap the amount of work I'm doing, but then I'm going to switch or slowly morph those to more of the threshold style workouts. So it's going to probably start with reduction in a little bit of a reduction in rest. So as opposed to doing 1 part work rest, it'll be 5 minutes of work, 4 minutes of rest. And, I'll have to get a little creative with, like how I actually go about doing that, especially if I am running on a hill out there. But that's kind of the point, is like, I'm trying to make that roof as high as I possibly can and be as sturdy as I can possibly get it if like that economy sort of value, like kind of shakes out. And then as I get closer to that race, translate that into raising the second floor. And I will say, it's like, well, what about like zone 2 training and stuff like that? The way I use my zone 2 training is I'd love to get your opinion on, how I'm approaching this, but I do a VO2 max workout on Monday after, like kind of a full weekend's rest, which is like feels the best for me. And then I follow that up with a little bit shorter VO2 max style workout on the bike, because I find that having like both of those stimuli, back to back, it doesn't hurt my bike workout. And I feel like it's a pretty good stimulus to continue to get me better at the run. Yep. And then what I do is I essentially, like, after those 2 days, I'm pretty trashed.
Yeah.
And then I follow that up with 2 zone 2 days. And I'm going to put zone 2 in quotes, because the purpose of that workout isn't to develop mitochondrial content, isn't to develop, capillary density, even though that's probably a side effect of doing a little bit longer workouts, like an hour to an hour and a half. But the point is just to go out and move and do something that's different than what I'm doing, fuel correctly, and then build how sturdy my first floor actually is. Because we know that volume is important for endurance races, and
Absolutely.
a 40 to 60 minute race is an endurance race. So So I use that to build some level of volume without accumulating then more fatigue. It gives me 2 days, because I do a trail run on Wednesday, and then I do just like a bike on Thursday, and then I finish out the week with a true kind of like tempo/threshold run that's like just on the trails.
Yeah.
And that's like the real specificity sort of thing, in terms of training right now. And that's been working out so well. It's like, knock on wood, and it's, so what's your take on that? Like, what do you think?
I think that makes a lot of sense. And the thing about zone 2 training that I think everybody, and I think you're kind of alluding to this, is that, like, yes, it is beneficial and it is important. A lot of your zone 2 training is maintenance. It keeps you where you are. It provides this ever building platform that you can do the rest of the work on top of. But there is nothing really special about the intensity. And if you are one of those athletes that is like, I'm just going to do zone 2 all the time, for some athletes that this is going to work really well, but those are athletes that probably have a very low number of years in the sport, because like the great thing about noob gains, those first 3 years are magical. Anything you do works, and like, and I mean, like, up to a point. Like, if you were to do VO2 max training every day when you're starting out, you're probably going to get hurt, sick, burnt out pretty fast.
But that's the same thing with zone 2 training. If you do too much of it to start, you're going to wind up in the same sort of issue, with the same sort of issues. And that is something that I think is overemphasized in this, day and age right now, is the importance of zone 2. And I don't get me wrong, I think all of these aspects are important. Zone 2, tempo, threshold, and VO2 max stuff. It's just the dose is where it's super important, and it's context specific. If I was training for an Ironman, one of my only goals would be to build up kind of like zone 2, or probably easier, like volume. And I would do some level of VO2 max development, or just like sprinty sort of stuff, just to keep that high end. But that would be more of my focus. Yeah. And, I think that's where, like, I think it's really dangerous to be like, oh, well, I am, just a zone 2 athlete, or I am just a VO2 max athlete. It's like, no. We've already debunked that shit, like, hundreds of years ago, according, it's like with like training history and other things like that. We need a mixture of it. And the mixture it's like I think of training as like, kind of like equalizers and, changing the different frequencies and stuff like that.
Yep.
All of them are always engaged at all times. Just the extent to which they're engaged is going to change based on what your goals are, based on, what your specific limiter is. If it's if you can identify it, from physiological testing, kind of like I have a little bit, because so actually I want to round this out with like the physiological testing.
Well, I do, and I also want to talk about your method. I want to talk about your program.
yeah.
Which I think like makes a lot of sense, and especially the way you're setting it up, like that. Usually, like if I'm, like say I just take an athlete that's just like a bog standard athlete is just a normal, which doesn't exist. Like it's like physics, like where, physics class where there's like no gravity and there's no friction. Like the perfect athlete,
the perfect athlete.
Right. But like doing those high intensity workouts in the week when you are fresh is really important, because otherwise you can't literally, you can't achieve the intensity that you need in order to get the intervention that you want.
Right.
And I also really like the doubling up within 2 days. Like we know that like really, if you do an incredibly intense workout, it's not the next day, it's 2 days later that most of the time, and this is going to be different depending on like training history. Somebody who's really new, you give them 3 5-minute VO2 max intervals on a Monday. That person is not going to be okay until Friday or Saturday. But if you're a good coach, you're not giving a newbie 3 by 5 minute VO2 intervals. Precisely. You're giving that person 3 90-second intervals and making sure that they can move correctly, that they're not going to hurt themselves. One workout that I love to give athletes that they are always like floored by is if they have a race on a weekend, so they've got like a Sunday race, like a 10K or a half marathon or something like that. And for whatever reason, we have missed out on some specific speed work in the last training block. I'll be like, I want you to go do your race. And then I want you to go to the track and I need you to do 5 800s. And a lot, like almost every time that's the reaction that I get. And then the workout, there'll be like, these were my best 800s I have done this quarter. And that's one of the things, like with an athlete that like knows their body and knows like, okay, I can handle 3 5-minute hill workout at VO2 max and then follow that up the next day. I bet you have more success doing it the way that you're doing it than if you were to put that bike ride on a Wednesday. I think you actually would feel pretty flat. And then you're giving yourself 2 easy days. And then you get your like, everybody, threshold is moderate intensity. Say it with me. Threshold is moderate intensity. Threshold is moderate intensity. You're getting your specific moderate intensity when, once again, you're a little fresh. I don't know what you're doing for the weekend, but I know you have dogs. I know you're probably out like walking those dogs around. You have horses. I am guessing that on the weekend, you are fairly active, even if you are not doing specific endurance training. And like, this is something that a coach needs to ask you. Right. Because like, if I didn't know that you were outside, like fixing fences, like dealing with, like your rural home, which probably requires a significant amount of upkeep, I might be like, well, can you give me a 3-hour ride on Saturday and maybe like a 90-minute run on Sunday? And you might try that before telling me no. And then we lose 2 months. Right. And like, that's the tragedy. That's the problem. Like, yes, athletes getting hurt is a real problem. Losing time is a bigger problem. Like if it's a mismatch that could have been avoided by proper communication, that's just such a bummer.
Yeah. And that's like my coaching philosophy is like, I want to take all this, as much of the science as I possibly can, but then I also take a lot, like very conservative approach, just because I've been the type of individual who gets injured fairly easily. And I am always a huge, like my blocks for endurance success are consistency, then specificity, then progression. And, so above all else, consistency. So if you can't do like the 2 VO2 max workouts, for example, like, like on a Monday and a Tuesday. That's fine. Like, today, okay. So actually a little bit of background, because it's funny you said this. We took all of our dogs to, up to one of the snow parks, near Sisters. And we went Christmas tree shopping, and Michaela brought her dog sled. I brought my cross country skis, and we went like 6 miles yesterday, 3 hours. Eventually the dogs get tired, so then you're double pulling, and it's just like absolutely exhausting. Yeah. And so today I was like, wow, that was actually a lot more, that was like 3 hours worth of exercise that we did yesterday. And, typically I do move around on the weekends, but I take them off because, again, the most important thing for me are like those 2 workouts on Monday and Tuesday, at least right now. Yeah. And so I was like, ooh, I don't know how it's going to feel, going in and doing this, doing this hill workout today. And, so I gave myself the okay to say, if you feel like shit on like the first round, then just call it and just, go for a jog the rest of the day.
Right.
I felt so good that I like almost PR'd. Like, so I do like a 1 all the way up the hill. So I almost PR'd on the first interval. And then the next 2 intervals were also faster. I was looking back at like the the workouts that I had done with only 2 intervals. Like my average was faster with 3 intervals than my fastest 2 average today. So we'll see how I feel tomorrow, because that's real. That's going to be the real tell. Is like I'm probably going to be feeling it pretty good, but who knows? Like I've been taking this approach where I've been eating more, trying to fuel myself, and it's been really helping a lot. Getting better sleep, doing other things like that. Those are all things that, I would love to talk about, but I'm pretty sure we're running out of time at this point.
But the other, so the thing is like, if tomorrow you're like, oh, okay, I can't do this bike VO2 max workout. Like what a sensible coach does is like, well, great. So let's do our easy days, Tuesday and Wednesday. Let's try the VO2 max on the bike on Thursday, and then just do the threshold session on Friday. Don't do the threshold session on Thursday and then try to do the VO2 max session on Friday. Because then, you're just mixing all the colors. And when you mix all the colors, you get brown. Brown is not great. It's just like, I wish. And the other thing is like tracking the etiology of why you felt good today is pointless.
Right. You're like
we could make so many different hypotheses. Like, all right, your aerobic system is like opened up because you did a lot of like cross country skiing, and like, what the fuck does aerobic system opened up even mean? Like it's like, I don't know if you like, so like this whole concept of toxins like is not actually a thing. And so like whenever I hear people talking about like toxins leaving the body or whatever, there's so much shorthand that like, because humans really want to be like, this is because of this, that, we start looking for hypotheses why you felt good today. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that you did feel good and you had a plan in place if you didn't. And that's what a coach does.
But I do think it is valuable to say like track changes that you've made like the eating more, right? That has been a big thing that I've changed, and it has definitely impacted my ability to perform multiple times per week. So that's like, I just have to keep saying that to myself, because I am the type of person who has a tendency to eat less. And now that I've made it an effort to eat more, and by eating more, I mean, I did an RMR at the beginning of this block. It basically said you need to be eating probably 3,700 calories per day, just based on what you do. And I've been making an effort to at least hit that, if not more. And then it's all, so I've seen increases or kind of corrections in like things like my like blood markers, like testosterone is actually like not like failing anymore. It's actually like moved back up. Vitamin D has started to come back up. I feel better during my workouts. I feel better, more energy throughout the day. And I think it came from sleep. Well, I think it came from the nutrition side of things, just eating more, and then the sleep side of things. So those are things that I had made a specific change to see is that going to impact my ability to actually take on more load and do things like that. And it has.
And you're tracking it on a much bigger time scale, which is and that's the point I'm trying to make, is that like we can never point to one workout and say, oh, this is because of this. But what you're doing, again, this is like one of those moments of like, let's take the researcher mentality. Like, all right, what would a researcher do? A researcher would formulate a hypothesis that if you ate more based on that resting metabolic rate number, that things might get better. And so now you're trying it. And lo and behold, all of your workouts are better. So you're like, okay, hypothesis seems to be working. And like that, I think is, to like get back to where we started about like, what could coaches take from physiologists and what could physiologists take from coaches? The thing that I want coaches to take from physiologists is a scientific approach of hypotheses and validation. Because like, it doesn't matter if it's a case study or a population study, that's still how you need to work in order to figure out what is going on. And to do it in a sensible and responsible way. So like, that's what I want my predominant population to take from your side. What do you think physiologists can and should take from the coaching side that could improve research, that could improve physiology?
Yeah, I think, I think again, there's two sides here. It's like the exercise physiologist who is doing the physiology testing. I think like using the approach of learning who the individual is and then prescribing or giving them actionable items from the physiological testing that you're doing. Like I think that would allow for the adoption of a lot of this physiological assessment, because many people I talk to, they're just like, oh, I don't need to do that because I already know that I'm pretty good. And it's like, well, what are you going to give me? It's like, well, so now I'm going to give you, if you come to me and do a VO2 max test, I'm going to tell you at least like one or two action items that's like based on exactly that house analogy that I was saying. And I think that makes it much more powerful is you say, okay, well, your zone 2 is actually dog shit. Like, it's so bad. You need, and you're doing, like 7 high intensity interval training sessions per week. Can we convert 2 of those to zone 2? Like that, almost that easy. And if you work with a lot of type A individuals, especially people who like to do, like the functional fitness side of things and other things like that, it's actually fairly, it's like if you just get to know the individual, it's a fairly easy fix. Whereas it gets a little bit harder when you start to get into the performance side of things, because then you do have to sit down and have a conversation with somebody and say, well, your VO2 max is super high, but your second threshold really, really low, kind of like what I had initially thought. It's like, oh man. So if that was the case, then it was like, okay, well, let's actually get second threshold up if this is an appropriate time to do it, and if you're not planning on getting it up higher, later on in the season, right? So that's what I think, like the exercise physiologist who is doing physiological assessment should do is get to know the person who's coming in your door and then give them individual recommendations, as opposed to just being like, oh yeah, lose some weight and, do some high intensity interval training.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, dude, come
thank
on.
Thank you, subject RC 68592. But you get what everybody else gets.
So individualize your prescription. And then for like the researchers writing the articles and the papers, I think seeing what those ends of one are actually doing and what's making them successful could be pretty good hypothesis driving sort of things.
Yeah, right.
Oh, well, we noticed this individual got really good because they did the, double threshold days. And I mean, we see it, like the Norwegians did the double threshold days, and there was a paper that followed up and was like, yeah, we had people do either double threshold days or single threshold days. And guess what we found? The single threshold days were really good at developing those physiological markers, VO2 max, second threshold, first threshold. Those double threshold days are actually really good at accumulating time at race pace without overdoing it. So there's two use cases here now.
Yeah.
And, so the more researchers talk to coaches, it's like you can actually probably get some pretty cool actionable hypotheses that you can test. And who knows, maybe it's maybe it's null and maybe it's negative findings, but that's also good to know, because then you can say, oh, well, we had, 25 recreational athletes do double threshold days and all of them got worse. So the outcome here is, oh, hey, for recreational athletes, probably don't do that. Which is like, Chris, you're laughing because you're like, I would not have my recreational athletes do this.
What a bad idea.
Yeah. But at the same time, it's like a lot of the times, like if you can point to a piece of data, then people are a lot more likely to listen to it.
Yeah.
So yeah, dude, this was an awesome conversation. I really hope we can continue.
I know we got to keep doing this.
Dive into the weeds and other things like that.
What's funny is we didn't even really like go into the weeds. Like we stayed fairly like up above like the weediness of it. Yeah. And because like, which I also think is really interesting. Like I think that you can talk about these really gnarly ideas, you know, if again you're like, you agree on your terms. You agree, like, what does this mean? Like when I say this, what does it mean to you? Right. And so we can arrive at that like shared vocabulary of actually like having a conversation, which is crucial for coaching, which is crucial for anything, where we're trying to like develop information. But yeah, no, we should do more of this.
Yeah, no, if you guys enjoyed this and you're listening on the Critical Oxygen podcast, you can give us a 5-star review on Spotify. Head over to Chris's podcast as well. He's got a bunch of cool, it's like, newly formed, but, definitely a bunch of cool episodes. What's it called?
The Infirmary.
The Infirmary.
Because my Campfire is the name of the coaching company. And so, yes, everything is camp themed. I did work many summers as a camp counselor, a trip leader, and there's this like hilarious patch in the mid-aughts where myself and like 3 or 4 of my best friends were essentially running a summer camp, and we're like 25. We're like, why have we been given this responsibility? Yes. The reason that my podcast is called The Infirmary is, like we talked a lot about today, there are so many misconceptions in the endurance world that lead to bad outcomes where athletes are sick, where athletes are hurt, where athletes are burnt out. I want you to come to the infirmary and then depart. I do not want you to spend much time there. And so that's please come, listen. And this is going to be a really great show.
Yeah, no, I love, like the way that you approach your coaching. And like, I think that really, helps us have better conversations. So if you guys have any suggestions for things you want us to tackle next, maybe it's the, perspectives on a paper, right? From a coaching perspective and a physiology perspective. Actually, that's probably the next thing we'll probably talk about is a number of different meta-analyses. Cool. Just came up with that idea. But if you guys have any questions or anything like that, you can always find me on Instagram, Critical02. DM me with your questions. If you have any, if you want to do physiological testing or other things like that, want to learn about it.
You guys should do it.
Yeah. Chris, where can they find you?
You can find us at Campfire_endurance on Instagram. You can find me on Instagram at Christopher Bagg. I do most of my endurance stuff over at Campfire. If you come and see my personal Instagram, you'll see some endurance stuff. You'll also see some stuff about books because that's, something that happens there. And then you can find the company at campfireendurance.com.
Yep. Awesome. Well, hopefully this is the first of, many, like recordings with Chris. Thanks for coming on, man. Speaking from the critical oxygen side of things, what we're going to do is we're going to cross post these. So you'll probably see the episode on his podcast as well. Or if you came over from the other one, welcome. We hope you guys enjoyed this episode, all about, kind of the translational nature of, where coaching meets science and the art of, where coaching meets both science and art. Cool perspectives. We hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and we'll catch you in the next one.